we acknowledge that country for Aboriginal peoples is an interconnected set of ancient and sophisticated relationships.
The University of Wollongong spreads across many interrelated Aboriginal countries that are bound by the sacred landscape, an intimate relationship with that landscape since creation.
From Sydney to the Southern Highlands to the South Coast. From freshwater to bitter water to salt. From city to urban to rural.
The University of Wollongong acknowledges the custodianship of the Aboriginal peoples of this place and space that has kept alive the relationships between all living things.
The university acknowledges the devastating impact of colonisation on our campus's footprint.
And commit ourselves to truth-telling, healing and education.
Thank you everyone for joining us here today. It's wonderful to have you, those who are here in the audience and also those who are online. So I love technology and we can actually extend this out beyond those that can physically be here. I'm Summer May Finlay. I'm a senior lecturer here at the University of Wollongong with Health and Society, and I have the pleasure of hosting this dialogue on the Uluru Statement with these two amazing panellists. So I know both of them. I'm really lucky to know both of them. Jeff Scott, he's someone who I've had respected for quite some time. He used to be my CEO at National Congress of Australia's First People, which was a representative body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Also formerly the CEO of the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council. We also have Thomas Mayer here. Come in. Thomas Mayer here. So Thomas works for the Maritime Union of Australia. He is an author. He has written children's books about the Uluru Statement and also written other books about the Uluru Statement as well. I highly encourage you to read them and buy them. They're amazing gifts because I think it's important, particularly that we educate children on the Uluru Statement. So I'm just going to hand over to these guys. They can do themselves justice in terms of telling you a little bit more about themselves than I can. And I just actually want to hand over first to Jeff. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself and also what has brought you to be so passionate about the Uluru Statement.
Thank you, Summer, and thank you for having me along for this discussion this afternoon. I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners on this country we're meeting today and pay my respects. I've been involved in Aboriginal politics for the last 40 years, I suppose. Very intricately involved in it. Been lucky enough to hold a number of positions in different organisations. But there's always been a tenuous relationship with government. And I suppose our drive here is to try and make that more certain and to put Aboriginal people in a position where we can actually drive those outcomes and actually play a greater role in the decision-making part.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thomas, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself and what's brought you to be so passionate about the Uluru Statement?
Yeah, so Torres Strait Islander follower. I pay my respects to the traditional owners as well, and elders past and present. I was a wharfie for 16 years, and so I got involved. I learned about the value of unity and how important it is to stick together and use your leverage. I want to acknowledge some comrades in the room here from the MUA, the branch secretary and former branch secretary here. I learned about unity and leverage and sticking together and getting things done for a membership on the wharves. Became a union official in 2010 and organised rallies and those sorts of things in response to the really harmful decisions that were being made in Parliament. And through that, I started to learn this issue with our own advocacy, how it's far too ineffective, that the decision makers aren't being held to account. And so I became involved in the Uluru Statement process when I was invited to a regional dialogue in Darwin and was elected as a delegate to go to Uluru. I'm really passionate about it because I think that what it proposes, taking the lessons from the past, is very powerful. It's important for all of us. And so that's, and I haven't stopped fighting for it since we made it happen 5 years ago.
No, and you haven't, absolutely. So just to let you know, I'm going to ask these guys some questions and that gives you time to understand a bit more about the Uluru Statement, but then to actually ask some of your own questions later, and that goes to online as well. So please submit your online questions, and I will pick up my phone at that stage. I won't just be texting or checking emails. I'll actually be looking at your questions. So please make sure that you actually are prepared to ask some questions, because we need to know what you need to know to campaign and support the Uluru Statement. So what is the Uluru Statement? I'm going to get these guys to actually tell you a bit more about it, but the summary of it is voice, treaty and truth. And that's what's in the Uluru Statement. So I'm going to throw to you, Thomas. Can you tell us a little bit about what the voice means in relation to the Uluru Statement?
Well, the voice is simply the ability for us to influence the decisions that are made about us all the time. As I said, the decisions that have been made about us to date have been harmful. They've failed us. They are the reasons, I think, that we have, the gaps in life expectancy of almost 8 years. It's the reason why we're so disproportionately incarcerated. The health issues and education outcomes, it all relates to the decisions that are made in Parliament. They set the laws and policies, which include how states and territories do things. And so a voice is about influencing those decisions that are made. It's also about holding politicians to account, to have that strength of voice that can unapologetically do that. And it's also about being able to campaign, to be able to determine our priorities and be in the front of decision making. And it's such an important thing.
Absolutely. And it's really important that the voice is constitutionally enshrined. And that's partly because of our history. Jeff, do you want to share with the audience who may not be as familiar with Indigenous history about why the constitutionally enshrined is important?
Well, our history of engagement with government has been a checkered one, and everybody to date has been either a policy or a bit of legislation. And history will tell us that each one of those bodies has been abolished by the government of the day when it took a view that no longer wished to hear from that voice. So that having the voice enshrined in the Constitution is one way of giving us certainty, and it's a real structural reform which the government can't change. It must give real effect to. I was lucky enough to be the executive director of the referendum council who did the consultations, and they were very structured forums. We held 12 regional dialogues around the country, and they were strictly designed to get people's views on the table, run through all the options that were there, and it was a process of both education, debate, and seeking the best advice possible. So that the outcome in Uluru Statement is a reflection of those dialogues that came from the people who went to those 12 forums, or 13, including the Canberra one, and also attended the Uluru Convention.
Yeah, I think it's not only about the protection of the voice, but it's also about that voice being empowered by the Constitution, that structural reform. But also what's important to consider here is that when we win a referendum to enshrine the voice, we are also, the Australian people, providing a really strong mandate that voice should be listened to. A double majority of people saying yes to that voice, says to the decision makers, for all time, that they must listen to what the voice says and must act on it.
Yeah, there's no mucking around with that, is there? So that brings us to the next part around truth-telling. Thomas, do you want to just share with us about why you think truth-telling in this country is really important?
Yeah, truth-telling is important. I mean, to win a referendum, we're going to need people to have a grasp of the truth, right? They need to understand why this should be done. But I just want to say, I want people to understand that the reason why the voice is the thing that we're focusing on here is not only because it's the most difficult thing to achieve, but it is because the truth is lacking a voice right now. We have been doing truth-telling for a very long time. There's truth-telling in many books going back a long time, the Boyer lectures, way back, what was it, W.E. Stanner, The Great Australian Silence, documentaries and movies, more and more nowadays. Royal Commission reports are chock-a-block full of truth-telling, like the rawest possible truth-telling that you can get. The thing is that when it comes to truth-telling, yes, it's very important. It's an ongoing thing. It's something that needs to be done better. But the politicians that make those harmful decisions, they already know the truth. What's missing is the political power for First Nations people to get them to implement all those recommendations that they should have done, like for deaths in custody over 20 years ago. So we really need that voice. We need that voice to be able to use the truth to get outcomes.
Yeah, because we've had organisations in the past like ATSIC and National Congress of Australia's First People sharing that truth and consistently, and you're absolutely right. Those organisations were either defunded or the legislation abolished. So we absolutely need the voice. Treaty. We've all heard about Treaty. We all know the song. It is something that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been campaigning for so long. But a lot of people actually don't understand what a treaty means, Jeff. Can you kind of maybe just share what a treaty is?
Well, there are many. Well, we're one of the few Western societies that don't have a relationship formalised in any treaty with the Indigenous people of the country, First Nations people. But a treaty is an agreement between, enduring settlement between the Indigenous people and the government. Now, I think we have to have a real hard conversation about the treaty itself, about what's involved in it. Treaty is about a compromise. It's about putting your issues up and how you debate them, who could actually sign the treaty, who's involved, what the scope is and what the range of issues are. Remember, a treaty is you have one go at it. And our experience overseas is that the thing you have to work on most is how you actually implement it and how you handle breaches. But to have a proper treaty process, I think we need a voice. Someone to ensure there are enough resources, that it's done properly, it's done appropriately, and the right people are involved in it. And it just levels the playing field. And without that organisation, if you like, the outcome from a treaty is problematic. We have many being done at the moment at the state government level, but we're lacking that leadership at the national level. Because there's a real scope of what a treaty can cover at both at a state and national level, and it needs to be very carefully managed and very carefully discussed and debated. So a voice is essential, and that sequence of having a voice first is vitally important. If you've got the voice that can actually ensure that the processes that will follow it, be truth-telling and treaty, will be done properly. And we will get the outcomes we're seeking. It's holding government to account, not just for the programs and policies that are there, but also for the truth-telling and the treaty negotiations.
I mean, if you want an example of why we actually need a voice, we've had 230-something years of non-Aboriginal people making decisions for us, and we're not exactly in a very good position. So quite frankly, we need that voice to make sure that the next 230 years is a damn sight better. So that's my summary of why we need a voice, because you're absolutely right, because we could have a treaty negotiation, we could have a truth-telling, and if we don't have Aboriginal leadership that are elected by Aboriginal people leading the terms of reference, setting the agenda, all of that stuff, then we aren't necessarily going to be confident that they are what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need.
Yeah, well, just something about treaty. I mean, we're in a federal system, right? The federal government has the majority of power. As Jeff mentioned, that treaties are underway. In Victoria, it's been almost a decade of a treaty process. The Northern Territory has begun. Tony McAvoy, the Treaty Commissioner there, has just handed his report to government recently. Queensland has started a process, and we actually have a Liberal government for the first time that has indicated they'll do it in Tasmania. So this is something that is gaining momentum with the support of the Australian people. You know, the song has made a difference, I think. But we really need to, it's like for First Nations in those states and territories that are working on treaty, it's almost like they have a limited log of claims that they can put on the table without the federal government involved. So just to reiterate that importance of the national, a national representative body that's able to reckon with the Commonwealth about what their obligations are to treaty, that's really important. Another really important thing to consider is South Australia, what happened there. Treaty experts say that they'll take decades, right? Because of the complexity so long after first contact. It's very different to, the other treaties in the other nations in the world. In South Australia, a hostile government came along and they put the process back to square one, just completely dismissed the treaty process. Victoria, the First Nations there are always concerned about what will happen with that. And so a national body will help to keep keep those states and territories accountable during negotiations. And then when treaty outcomes are reached, as Jeff said, it's that constant battle. There'll be a constant battle legally and politically about getting those outcomes.
So you probably all know about the Uluru Statement and you've heard about it. And I know, and you've both talked about polls. One's come out today. What kind of support is there for the Uluru Statement, particularly for the Voice at the moment?
Yeah, so in August last year, Crosby Textor, a conservative pollster, they did campaign polling, which indicated that very close to 60% of the Australian people would vote yes at that point. This is really significant because we have had no campaign resources, almost no campaign resources, right? Turnbull dismissed the Uluru Statement in 2017 with utter disrespect. The Referendum Council that did the dialogues, they finished up in June when they handed the Referendum Council report to the government. So it's been with the support of universities, my union, Auntie Pat Anderson through Lowacha, whatever, people putting in their own funds and money, to travel around and build this people's movement. That's 60% without leadership in Parliament. It's really significant.
Yeah, I think that increasing level of support across the country is a testament to, I think, the fair-mindedness and the fairness of the Australian public. I think we have to make the best use of that now when that's such a high level.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just on that.
And I'm just saying that at the moment, there's that level of support, keeping the support bubbling along for the last 5 years is a testament that people have been involved in it. It's Megan Bayless, Pat Anderson, and all the other issues as well, and Thomas himself, getting out there and letting the public know what's going on, holding talks and going through them. But again, and then we had a Prime Minister come along who turns up and gives us hope, not fear.
Yeah.
And his first words were, his mandate was to put the Uluru Statement, to get a voice in the Constitution. And that's a real message for us, that the Labor Party's committed themselves to it. Opportunity is now. We must take hold of that and achieve it.
Yeah, the research shows and this is important for you all going forward in supporting this, is that the people that say they'll vote yes do so because of that fair-mindedness. They think it's a fair thing to do, right? It should have been done before, a lot of people say. Also that it's a unifying reform, that this is going to somewhat mature our nation, that it's something that we should do for our identity, to bring 60,000 years of ongoing culture into the DNA of who we are, our constitution, and also that that it can make practical difference. Actually, it's pretty positive that in the opposite direction, those that say they'd vote no, the research shows that they'd say no based on thinking that it's only a symbolic reform and not practical. So that argument about how this is a practical, that how this will practically help Indigenous people is something that you can use to help change people's minds.
So there's a lot of conversation around the Uluru Statement, and one of the things that comes up regularly is how can people support a constitutional change if they don't know the details? So how do you explain to people why where we're at is really important and the details will come later?
I think it's important to put in place here that a voice in the Constitution is a vision and a focus on how we can make our lives better and actually Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people get to play that role in determining our futures. Now there's detail around about what's in the report. We've had the co-design report, which is out there now and circulating, and we have a fair amount of detail on what's in the report, and there'll be more coming out over the next few months. But that's a level of detail, but the complete details will be worked out when we get to have a government formally reviewing the outcomes of the referendum.
And just to add to that, there's going to be a strategic, there's an important piece of strategic thinking in this as well. Because referendum, if you have too many details before a referendum, each of those details can be used in a no case. So, this is going to be worked out with the government over the next, 6 months, 8 months, what that level of detail will be. I think the simplest response when you hear that question is that it's a representative body. right? There's loads of representative bodies in this country. You've got unions, you've got business associations. The parliament is a representative body. We're not saying that 700,000 blackfellas are going to descend on Canberra, you know, every sittings. But there's going to be layers of representation, local, regional and national. Simple stuff.
Yeah, there's significant resources being devoted to try to improve the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around the country. And frankly speaking, the level of effort going in and the outcomes doesn't demonstrate the outcomes we need. And part of this process is to make sure that there is focus on meeting the needs and aspirations of people, especially at the local level. People on the ground actually want to know that their voice counts. We'll have to design and put in place a body that will actually let those voices come through. And it won't be right on the first day. It'll evolve over time. The needs and aspirations on the first day won't be the same as it will be in 10 years' time. So it's an evolving body, an evolving organisation, the same as anybody does. And that's how we've got to design it. You know, put a straitjacket, at the same time you put enough detail in place to make sure it works. And each part of the country will have a different view about how they want to be represented and how their voices will be heard. But the challenge here is to make sure their voices are heard and there is a better life for our children.
So there's also a conversation about, and we've all probably heard this, that of those of us that are actively involved in the conversation around why we don't legislate the voice first before we actually go to constitutional change. There's two reasons for that I hear. One is that we're constitutionally shy in making changes, so we should legislate first. And another one is because we don't need it in the Constitution, therefore, because we can have it legislated. What would be your response to people asking those questions?
Well, firstly, on legislating first, it's like, you know, it's a bit paternalistic to say, we have to see you blackfellas, you know, have a voice first so that we can make sure that you're going to behave and it'll operate all right. You know what I mean? Come on. The other thing about it is that if we don't have the courage to go to a referendum and constitutionally enshrine this, the most important thing to always put at the front of this is that every other voice has been destroyed. So we have to have the courage to go there. If we were to just legislate it first, to reiterate, it will be destroyed by a hostile government. Now, some people say, yeah, let's legislate first and then we'll promise you we'll have a referendum later. We won't reach a referendum if we do that, because if the voice does what it's meant to do and holds politicians to account, then no politician is going to want to pass a referendum bill that will lead to the voice having more power, right? If the voice has problems, like all human organisations will, they'll do what they did to ATSIC. They'll amplify those problems, and again, it takes away that opportunity for a referendum. So we've got great momentum now, and we just need to keep that going and get this done with the right level of detail at the front end, and we can win.
Yeah.
And we've got to remember the people that want to make this work and make it work the best are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This is about holding the government to account, having a say in what our futures are and what the future of our children are. So it's beholden to us to make it work. I'm sure there's enough people in this country who can do it. Yep. I have faith in them, and we all must.
And I want to acknowledge young Hudson up there. He's got my book there. G'day, mate. You know, young Hudson. I mean, he might be the voice one day from this area. You know, place for him to step up to, a platform that we build. Absolutely,
definitely be a different future for our children. Mine's 9 months old. If we have a voice, her future will be different. I've had a great 41 years, but I would like to see it better in this country for the next generation, and this is one way of doing it. Now, we've got a fantastic question from our not live audience, not you gods, the online audience. You will get your opportunity though, I promise. So both panellists have mentioned that the previous failed bodies, ATSIC and National Congress of Australia's First People, we only failed because of the government, not because of us, by the way, just want to clarify that. What lessons have you learned from these failures so we can use those going forward in a positive way for the voice?
Well, I think the two bodies, I've worked for both of them. I think they were both effective in their own right in putting things in place. ATSIC, I think, was a very successful organisation, despite what politicians say. I think it was lauded in its absence. It wouldn't have had an intervention or a cash card, or the CDP program, or the IS program funding 80% of non-Aboriginal organisations. That wouldn't have happened if ATSIC was there. And those issues in place, it had a very good name and body, but the point was it was subject to the machinations of the government today. You know, the Minister and the Prime Minister got up one morning and had a bad day, I'm going to abolish you. You know, that happened time after time. It happened with the ADC, it happened with ADC, it happened with the NAC, the ACC. So coming back and say, trust us, doesn't wash, really. We have to have certainty. We have to have structural reform which gives us real, meaningful power and influence. And in those bodies that was there, and I think when those bodies had that power and influence was when they were at their most vulnerable. Because politicians don't like being held to account. And that's what this body would do. And it's up to all of us, all over to make this work. I'm not sure we will.
Yeah, look, all those lessons. Sorry, Jeff. Okay.
No, so I think we have that support from the majority of Australians. The polls are telling us that. And with every passing month, those polls are increasing. The government's seen that. The new government's seen that. The new Prime Minister's seen that. It bodes well for our future.
Yeah, all those lessons, you know, it was a huge emotional investment, you know, for us to come together and have that massive, you know, convention in the heart of the country and have that debate and then pour our hearts and souls into reaching a consensus amongst ourselves. And then the last 5 years of work after Turnbull rejected it and us not taking no for an answer, we can't go weak-kneed right now. The greatest lesson is we have to have the courage to convince all those around us and the rest of the country to vote yes in a referendum to enshrine this and protect it.
Yeah. And meaningful reform is not easy. If it was, it had been done. It is hard, but it is worth it.
Can I say, so I was in my early 20s when ATSIC got disbanded, but I did have the pleasure of working for National Congress of Australia's First People. It was an amazing experience to work with a collective of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and non-Aboriginal people for a communal purpose. And that's one of the lessons that I learnt while I was there, is that we have the skills, the expertise within our communities. We have such strength and motivation. And so that's the lesson that I learned, is that when we have a platform, when we have an opportunity, we go for gold. Like, there is no holding back. We know what we need. So it's not actually, for me, about the lessons that we, you know, what I learned from that is we actually just need government to get out of the way and do the right thing. Because we have the skills and expertise within our communities and our allies to stand alongside us, championing the cause in a way that we want to be championed, which is why they're allies and why they stand with us. So that's probably my biggest learning from Congress.
Yeah, can I say something? I've learned over the years, just observing who our leaders are in all these different organisations, you know, like the health peak bodies, and that a lot of the people that worked at ATSIC, you know, like Jeff, and they're the leaders of today somewhat, you know, like you got Pat Turner, you've got Arnie Pat Anderson, Professor Megan Davis started there young, you know, as a young lawyer.
They cut their teeth there.
Pat Dodson, you know, like all these big names right now, Marcia Langton, they all somewhat learnt broader politics, black politics, the bureaucracy, you know, in this voice. It is a real training ground for the next generations to step up to. And so that's something that I also see as something, you know, really important for the voice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we have another question from here, and then we might go to a question from the audience. Jamie's taking her shoes off. Don't worry, I'd be taking my shoes off if I could, but I'm not allowed to. So there's a question that says, thank you and a great talk. This is a multi-barreled question, so I'm going to break it down, and so we can answer one part at a time. So I'm not going to throw it all at you, but what would a voice look like? So opponents say it will be a third chamber. Dodgy people say that. What would a voice look like in practice?
Well, there's a few points. I'll take the third chamber one first. That was a position put forward by the Prime Minister three Prime Ministers ago.
It's hard to keep track.
It is for Liberals.
Yeah.
They keep executing their own. But on the voice there, he put that view forward, knowing it was wrong. And so did Barnaby Joyce. But Barnaby Joyce had the good grace to come out and say I was wrong. It's not a third chamber. In no way is it. It's not an imposition. It's actually the power to influence decision-making of government, not to veto it. And that's what the voice will do. But the voice has got to have a structure. I mean, there's a bit of this debate to go on yet about what that structure is. The co-design report, as I mentioned before, is already in place. That gives us a lead into what people are thinking, what the current structures are. So, but the voice has got to actually ensure that local voices get heard. The people on the ground have, their voice has a chance to influence what happens. That'll be a measure of success or otherwise. And so that'll be a structure in place where each of the regions or localised organisations will have a chance to have their structures in place, vote for, put up their own representatives, their own views, their own needs and aspirations. And also, it's got to be structured in there that will influence the state government's programs. We have a structure here where the bulk of programs are coming from the Commonwealth, but all the human services and the others are controlled by the state governments. So it has to have that multi-layered approach. And getting and achieving that success and that approach is one of the keys to making the organisation work. So, and as I mentioned before, it'll evolve. And there's a few suggestions now about how it would work, but we're working through those. And before we have another round of consultations, I think people are thinking about that now. There are many organisations out there that represent the views and interests of Aboriginal people, but currently they're not influencing government decisions very much.
So we hear the third chamber does come up from time to time. How do our allies and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people kind of counter that conversation, that narrative? Maybe Thomas?
Yeah, it's bullshit.
Just start with that.
It's not a third chamber of parliament. It's just not, you know. I mean, geez, read the Referendum Council final report, listen to Indigenous leaders, read the Uluru Statement. It doesn't say third chamber to parliament, right? So the reason I think that they came out and said that with the, you know, with the coalition beholden to the right, was this was a tried and true scaremongering tactic, right? I watched Wick versus Queensland on NITV several years ago, and I saw John Howard basically saying this very same thing, that you know, that Aboriginal people are going to be able to veto legislation if this gets through, you know, this sort of crap. And so, yeah, it's a scaremongering tactic. That's all it was. It's just not true. They use that as a scaremongering tactic because, of course, Indigenous people would love to have a third chamber to parliament. We'd love to be able to, you know, block legislation that we don't like. But we know that it's impossible. Okay, we're not going to achieve that. The Australian people are never going to vote that up. It's an advisory voice, and I guess this is an opportunity to talk about that. Because it's advisory doesn't mean that it's powerless, though. The fact is nothing is more than advisory to Parliament. There's parliamentary supremacy. You know, it would be reaching too far to try and get that. The power in it is the ability for us to choose our representatives, and this goes to what it looks like again. For us to be able to choose our representatives, for us to be able to hold those representatives to account through the process of democracy, and for our representatives to come together regularly, which we don't right now, and have our debates in an informed and you know, well-resourced way to come together, reach consensus on what our priorities are and what advice we're going to give, and then that advice being the strongest possible advice that we can give. And when politicians choose to ignore that advice, and we're saying voice to Parliament here, so it'll be transparent to the people that are being represented and the broader Australia public, it's much more politically precarious for a government to say no to what we're saying. And then the other part of the power is for us to be able to campaign if they ignore us in a much more effective way than we have before.
Can I just say, it's probably the only time that I've ever agreed with Barnaby Joyce, is i.e. it's not a third chamber of parliament. Anyway, let's go to a question from the audience. Jamie, don't be shy, stick your hand up. Thanks. I always love an icebreaker, but it's...
My name's Mick Cross.
It's like you got a big voice.
My name's Mick Cross. I'm Secretary of the Maritime Union here in Port Kembla. I was lucky enough to be down the coast a few years ago now, Thomas, when you took the training down at Vincenia for that day we had down there. And I have been, and I have the privilege, as Gary has done as well, to stand in front of workers and represent workers. And what I saw that day was what the representation that was needed for Aboriginal people in this country. And, you know, the debate and the way that was spoken of that day was that mob down there were not going to allow the people who were going to push forward the Uluru Statement to tell them what they needed. It wasn't about that. It was about, you will represent us, and you'll represent us in the parliament and the needs of people in that area, just like mob all around the country. And I just thought from a representative aspect, it was such a wonderful debate and a wonderful thing to see for myself, to see how that was going to work. And that's true representation, because as a country, we have not represented Aboriginal people well at all for, like you say, some 230 years. So that's a small snapshot that I was privileged enough to see, you know, amongst Aboriginal people in our area. And if that's what this looks like, then I'm absolutely 100% for where we're moving forward, Thomas. So that was just a little snapshot, more a statement than a question. But if you wanted to move forward on, that's what I think the representation looks like, Thomas. Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks,
I do encourage questions, but that was a great statement, so supportive of that one. So thank you for that. Has anyone else got a question before I go back to the online? Got a question? Lucky you took your shoes off.
It's quite unusual for me. David Havard is my name. I'm a PhD student in economics. My question is the question about laws, parliaments, because you already mentioned the fact that the state parliaments also make a whole lot of laws that are relevant here. But a constitutional voice enshrined in the federal constitution can't really do anything about the states having to pay attention to it. How is that aspect to be resolved? Is it the idea that the states would have the opportunity to incorporate a reference in their constitutions?
No, yeah, so I think, no, absolutely, the voice can concentrate on the state if the state, you know, needs to do something or if they're doing something wrong. So I don't think, so if it's a national voice, that doesn't mean that it can't try and influence the states and what they're doing. That's, yeah.
But there's a complex relationship with these issues, and it's not true to say that the Commonwealth has all the powers in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They're concurrent powers. Both the state and the Commonwealth have those powers. The state has a lot of powers in terms of services, land management, key issues they need to resolve. Again, it's about negotiation, but it's having a body that is professional, is rigorous, is mature, and it will achieve its aims. And part of those aims are influencing decision making at both levels of government. And I would say including local government, where that's the closest to the community, and that affects the lives of people every day. So it's having that multi-layered approach. And one of the other bigger challenges here is how we ensure that has influence both at the state and federal level.
Well, just to add before you do, I think, you know, I mean, the voice, same as what sort of laws and policies it will try and affect, it doesn't need, it can decide what its priorities are, right? It doesn't, like, because sometimes the question comes up, would it only be able to speak to Indigenous legislation sort of issues? But it, you know, I mean, it could be about superannuation because it affects our people because, you know, we tend to die younger. But just the other thing that I wanted to add is that it could focus internationally, you know, in solidarity with other First Nations or, you know, on climate change and action, for example. It's really what we choose to focus on.
If I could just, before you get there, one real example about this is the current state of cultural heritage legislation across the country. We've got enough examples of how that is just disastrous where we stand now with Chilcombe Gorge. But the Commonwealth has dropped the bar so low that the states don't have a high bar to achieve. They're actually put in place their own laws. So that's one example of it. But to shine a light on injustice where it's in each of the states, the incarceration rates, the child protection issues, is something this body can do and give it real power. And that light needs to shine and be shone very brightly.
I guess where I'm getting confused, and you can correct me here, is I've always thought that the voice not only was constitutionally enshrined so that it existed, but there'd be something in there that talked about the requirement for the Parliament in certain circumstances to actively reach out to the voice. So does that not happen in the model?
Well, we expect the model itself, when it comes out in the voice itself, there's a requirement for the government to consult and to take that consultation and that advice into account in making their decisions. A voice can never fetter the decision-making of Parliament, but did that, the Parliament be given away its own decision-making. Now, I can't see that happening.
Yeah, and you also have to keep in mind the power of the Australian people enshrining that, you know, so that mandate, basically. There'd be an expectation, there's actually power in this. There'd be an expectation But if the government's making a decision that's going to affect Indigenous people, that they will go to the voice, regardless of any requirement.
And can I just respond to your state and territory versus national? We know that the state and territories collaborate with the Commonwealth government regularly. We've seen that with COVID, with the AHPP, I think it is. Don't ask me what the acronym stands for, I never get it right. We also know, say, with Closing the Gap, that was a Commonwealth initiative that was supported through COAG by the states. So there are mechanisms for the state and Commonwealth to get together and actually come up with an effective national approach, which is where I see the voice would also be influencing as well. So it's not like the states act independently on everything. Usually with policy that is both national and state and territory, there is a process of collaboration. So the voice will absolutely be involved in that, with my understanding. So we've got a question here, and I have to say this is a really good question because it's something that I hear all the time, and it's come from a non-Aboriginal person, a non-Indigenous person. They know that not all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people support the Uluru Statement. So, and they want to support it, but they're a bit, what it says here, I'll read it. I've always been a supporter of the Uluru Statement, but have been hearing that not all Indigenous Australians agree with the goals of it. As an ally, I want to ensure I understand the conversation and do my best to support a fair Australia. Could you speak more about people saying from the statement are not providing a voice for everyone? So basically, this person wants to support the Uluru Statement, but is concerned that they would be going against Aboriginal people that don't support it.
Yeah, so if we were to wait for 100% of us to agree to something, we would never go anywhere. We would just, it's like saying, okay, I'm happy with the status quo.
Yeah, not all the youth voted for Scott Morrison or Tony Abbott.
Yeah, so we're not homogenous. It's disappointing that we have to say that sometimes. I know this person's not saying that.
No.
It is difficult, you know, but geez, this is our moment in time. We did that hard work, you know, I talked about it earlier, to reach a consensus and to invite the Australian people to walk with us, for you to walk with us and not lag behind because, you know, someone else wants to stay behind. You know, we've really got to take this moment. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity, and we've got to grab it with both hands. And so what I say to people is, look, respect that there are differences of opinions, and you know, you have to sometimes acknowledge that people have those differences of opinions. But what I ask you to do is to think about it yourself. Consider the logic, consider all the lessons of the past that we have talked about that make the Uluru Statement, and then make up your own mind, and then get out there and talk to people that you can convince. There's some people that are always going to be entrenched against it, they'll never move. But there's a massive swathe of the middle Australia that can be moved and we'll get this across the line. Don't worry about the extremes.
Yeah.
I think we can never achieve 100% consensus on what the issues are. We're not the thought police. People are allowed to think differently. What we would ask is that people, when they're thinking about these matters, make an informed decision. An informed decision in the best interest of people, the best interest of the future and especially our children.
Another question from the audience. Is anyone? Oh, yep. Lady in the front here. Getting your 10,000 steps in today.
Hi, thanks ever so much for this. As a non-Indigenous person, and you've started to talk about this already, what are the tips and hints? What can we do to make a difference now and to try and influence for when the referendum comes out?
Yep. So the research shows this correlation of increasing support for the Uluru Statement since 5 years ago, with the numbers of people that say that they've learned a bit about the Uluru Statement. And so just sharing the Uluru Statement words with people that haven't heard it is a very powerful thing. So in your book clubs or in your sporting clubs or whatever, you know, or workplaces, just, you know, in the tea break or whatever, just read the Uluru Statement together. That is a very powerful action. The other thing is that the politicians still matter in this, right? They hold the constitutional door, and we need to convince them to open it, which means passing a referendum bill. So we need to even though Labor is committed to it, they're politicians and they'll still tend to take the easiest path. They need to understand that we can win this. So make your support loud and public wherever you can. Use social media, hashtags, all that sort of thing. With that support from one major party, we still don't have it from the other, but they're saying they're considering it. I've got my doubts, but we've got to try. I mean, we don't need bipartisanship to win. We don't need them, but we've got to do our best to convince them, because it'll make it much more certain that we will win. So I think it would be a good thing to do, to direct any correspondence towards Dutton, Price, whatever, bombard them with letters saying, hey, you've got to give bipartisanship. That's what you can do right now.
Okay, and I'll just make the point that I think you can talk to your friends, your colleagues, your workmates about the issues. I mean, appealing to the fair-mindedness of every Australian. I think Australian people on the whole are very fair-minded people who want the best country we can have. We've got a great country, but it can be better. Just being better than someone else isn't good enough. It's the best you can be. And I think that's the challenge we all have.
So if you're online, you've probably got 1 minute or 2 minutes to send through another question, so we've probably only got time for one or two more. We've got a question from over here. Fantastic, thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, my name's Jane, and I just wanted to encourage people here to take up the ideas that Thomas and Jeff are suggesting around local action. I'm part of an alliance that's based. Well, we would like to say we're a national alliance. We support the work of Thomas and other people who are working to get a referendum going, and would certainly encourage you, if you're interested and to set up a group in Wollongong that could become part of the broader alliance, and generally get out on the street promoting and talking to people about the voice, as Thomas and Jeff have said, and maybe liaising with people in the broader alliance. So I'm happy to, at the end of this, to take people's emails and sort of link people up if anyone is interested in that. Thank you.
Can I just say thank you, Jane, for your solidarity over many years. You know, some of the earliest supporters, there's a wonderful network of, alliance in this area and Sydney. So please approach Jane later. I'm sure they could use some more supporters on there. Thank you.
Can I just say, Thomas said before about international support, us supporting people internationally, but two of my colleagues who I work with in another capacity are online from Aotearoa, and they've just made a comment, and I want to share it because I want you to understand that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are pushing for this, but our Indigenous cousins in other countries are absolutely supporting us to achieve our goals as well. So they said, to our Indigenous cousins in Australia, privileged to listen from Aotearoa, New Zealand, much aloha and support from the Voice Plus, Emma and Adrian, and I love those two. So thank you for that, and it's great to hear that our cousins are over the ditch are actually also in support of this. We're going to wrap up really, really soon, but I think there's a really important question around what does success look like? What is success in terms of the Uluru Statement in all three components? Do you want to share your insights into what success would look like, Jeff?
Yeah, well, I think success is actually to a point where Aboriginal people are involved in the decision making and what their fates and futures are. To date, that's very, very incomplete or very measured. We don't have much say in what goes on. Politicians decide that. There are too many politicians that are our saviours and think, no, well, it's good for us. But this is when that actually does make a difference. We've got to remember here that what the Uluru Statement was a very eloquent and heartfelt appeal to the Australian people for a decision. And that should be, and that Australian people should have that opportunity to make that decision. And that's the message that I can leave with it.
Yeah, for me, it's an Australia where there isn't the gaps anymore, where we can expect to live as long as non-Indigenous people, where the incarceration rates are not so, so terrible. When we close those shameful gaps in all of those areas, I think that's the Australia that we want. And then beyond that, I think a voice, where we have contributed into our society being much more inclusive and equal, where those that are most vulnerable are cared for, and I think the voice would go on and do that sort of work as well.
So I'm not putting Thomas on the spot here because I did ask him before, but Thomas actually knows the Uluru Statement off by heart. Don't ask me to do it. I'm certainly not able to do it. And when we've heard here, from Jeff that it is a heartfelt statement. If you hear Megan Davis speak it, it's amazing. And so, Thomas, I'm just going to ask you, do you mind just speaking the Uluru Statement for those who are here and online?
Yeah, you're going to learn it, sis.
Okay.
All right?
Yeah.
We've got lots of campaigning to do, so it makes a difference. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did, according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished, and it coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That a people's possessed the land for 60 millennia, and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alien from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We see constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish, they will walk into worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is a culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarrata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967 we were counted. In 2017 we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future.
If that doesn't touch you, I don't know what will. Jeff, you've probably heard this a lot, but how does it feel hearing it again?
I think it was one of the most eloquent and well-crafted documents I've ever seen. I think it's been the most research written about document I've come across, and I think people will be testament to that. And Thomas just read it out. It is powerful. It's a message to the Australian people, and a message I think we can see the evidence that it is being heard. I think the politicians are now hearing that, and there'll be a chance to make a decision on it in about 12 months.
So, just final reflections from both of you before we wrap up. Where to from here, and what else would you like to share that we already haven't covered?
I just want to reiterate, this is our opportunity, right? This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. There's been decades of work go into this. It's not just the last 5 years. It's not just the several years that led to the Uluru Statement. It's all of that struggle before, all of those things that we've tried that have failed, all the broken promises, you know, all of the bastardry towards our people, coming together in this moment where you have an opportunity to change this country, to accept over 60,000 years of continuous culture as your own, as us, as our identity as Australians. And our children are so proud of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture when they learn about it. You know, they come home, they tell you about the latest language name that they've learned or about the Indigenous seasons. I mean, they don't know why we haven't done this already. For crying out loud, we've got to do it in this generation, and this is our opportunity. So let's go out there and fight for it.
Yes, and for me, I think achieving the enshrinement of the voice in Parliament will be will see the maturing of our nation. A time where our nation matures to a point where we go together as one, not as separate people. Our fates are tied to each other. And that's my hope and dream for the future.
For me, when I think about the Uluru Statement, I think it's a gift to this country. It's an absolute gift. It is a roadmap and it's a gift, and it's a legacy that we have an opportunity to leave for the next generations, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal. I think it's really important that we understand what the Uluru Statement is. We advocate around the Uluru Statement, to, as I said, to our friends, to our colleagues, to our MPs. It would be a shame to miss this opportunity because, and not to be a downer, but our life expectancy and our comorbidities, etc., aren't great. We need to make a change because it is our mob that die every single day. So we have to make a change, and this is the way we do it. Any other comments?
Our time is now.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
And the hashtag It's Time is really important if you're going to do it on Twitter. I encourage, if you're on Twitter, social media, get out there and share it today. Link into the statement around the Uluru Statement. The website, there's a whole bunch of information, Jeff, on which website?
Uluru Statement.
The Uluru Statement website. Please make sure that you're pushing it far and wide. We need the ripple effects. Every person makes a small ripple, and each of those ripples makes a big ripple until we actually have a change. So thank you very much. Thank you. Can we just thank the two panellists today? Could I just say it's an absolute pleasure hearing from them. The University of Wollongong is absolutely committed to reconciliation. They've made a commitment to the Uluru Statement, which is why we have these two gentlemen here. And so we just want to show you a bit about our commitment to the Uluru Statement. Reconciliation.
Our vision is a reconciled, united Australia where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are positioned as the knowledge holders of history, country, and culture.
We will create teaching, learning, and working spaces that are based on trust and respect, are free from bias and discrimination, and value our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander staff and students.
A dramatic and significant shift has occurred at UAW that shines a light on our institution's evolving commitment to addressing the plight of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples through truth-telling, cultural safety, and healing.
The UAW leadership team are committed to walking the reconciliation journey as allies with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues and community.
We are committed to the tough conversations and changes needed ahead.
We exist to be fearless in the pursuit of our purpose and to create a movement of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander allyship at UOW that will hold a shared vision for the future.